Senator from Oklahoma.
I came to the floor to spend some time on the unemployment insurance, but I have to comment after hearing my colleague mention his astounded and esteemed favor of the bill that's going to be in front of it. I would just have to say that my perspective is really totally different. You have a 1,500-page bill that nobody's read other than my staff, and we've read it completely and outlined it completely. You have a bill that's dishonest because you steal changes in mandatory funding and programs, and you created $17.9 billion out of nothing that everybody on the Appropriations Committee knows allows you to spend $17.9 billion but not pay for, and you transfer that sleight of hand to our children. But it doesn't seem to bother anybody on the appropriations that we actually lie to the American public about actually how much we're going to spend. The bill actually spends about $63 billion, the way you read it, more than we did last year, about 6.5%, 7%. It's loaded with parochial benefits, which is the pleasure of the appropriators, I understand, but it really doesn't pass muster in terms of no earmarks. But there's one point that I agree with. This has been an agreement between Republicans and Democrats to bring the bill to the floor. And it will pass because it is an agreement. Because people did work together, whether I like it or not, they worked together and came to a conclusion. The only problem is there's going to be no amendments, no way to be honest with the American people on this $17.9 billion that's supposedly paid for that isn't. Which is it's truly an untruth. It's dishonest, has no integrity with it whatsoever. It undermines every senator up here that's going to vote for this bill because you say one thing and you're going to do exactly the opposite. You know, I was just given a poll as of today. The number one problem that Americans see in our country is us. The U.S. government. 21% of the people in this country identify us as the problem. Is it any wonder? When we tell them we're going to do X and then we don't do X, i.e., we had a budget agreement and then we changed the budget agreement because we couldn't live within our means and we wouldn't raise the revenue to be able to do that. And then we come to a new budget agreement that's much higher, don't honor the previous budget agreement. And then we put an appropriation bill on the floor that's going to fund all the federal government until September 30th, and nobody's totally read it. They pick out the things they like in it and then talk about it. Is it any wonder why 21% of the people think that the Congress, politicians, poor leadership, corruption, and abuse of power in Washington is the number one problem with our country? You know what? They're right. This is an abuse of power to vote for a bill that you know spends $18 billion, $17.9 billion more than what you're telling the American people it's going to spend. And you do it through sleight of hand, and you pass muster with the powers that be, but it's not honest with the American public. So we're going to do it again. And we're not going to have a government shutdown. And everybody's going to get to go home on break and spend a week away from here and say, oh, look at us, we're not at loggerheads anymore. The only reason we're at loggerheads is because we've abandoned the processes of the Senate through the majority leader that does not allow the Senate to force consensus. And for the life of me, I don't understand why my colleagues on the other side of the aisle accept it. You get no amendments either. So we have one person out of 100 decides what amendments will be acceptable and what aren't. Jefferson has got to be spinning in his grave because he wrote the original rules for the Senate. It had nothing to do with one person deciding. Matter of fact, until 1917, one person stopped everything in the Senate if they didn't have consensus. And so the whole goal was to trade what you would like to do to give somebody else the ability to do that. When we have a czar running the Senate, we no longer have that ability. And the whole purpose for having a bicameral legislature with a minority rights provision protecting was so that we would generate consensus that could be sold to the American public so that their views. No, this isn't about me being able to offer an amendment. This is about the 4 million people in Oklahoma not having a say in the U.S. Senate. I mean, there's some really bright people in Oklahoma that have some really good ideas. But those ideas can't be heard in this body anymore. They're not my ideas. It's not my vote. It's their vote. And yet 54 of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle acquiesced their right for their states to offer their states' ideas as we debate issues in this body. You give that away and say one person gets to decide. It's never been that way in the Senate. Never before. So now we're going to have a bill. And the prime example of that is the unemployment bill. If this was really a priority for the majority leader, why are we doing it now instead of before it expired? All the weeks of time in quorum calls in the Senate when we could have been doing this, it wasn't a priority. It's a political priority. I actually think we ought to extend the unemployment insurance, but I think we ought to do it in a smarter way. And I certainly think we ought to pay for it. When I can sit and show $9 trillion of waste and spending reductions that the average American, 80% of the average Americans would agree with, and we can't find $20-some billion out of all this mess of a federal government to be able to help people who are not employed. My colleague from Delaware mentioned job training. The House actually is the only thing that has happened based on the GAO reports of this government on duplication. The House took it to heart, and they took the job training programs and they converted from, we have actually 47 of them, 47 job training programs, spending almost $30 billion a year, and they passed the Skills Act, which consolidated those into 6 programs that actually have metrics. When you study our job training programs, regardless of whether we fund them or not, here's what you find. Is all but 3 of them duplicate one another. All but 3. And none of them have a metric on whether or not they're actually training people to do a job, giving them a life skill. So the House passes that bill. We won't even take it up. You save money, you actually improve what the federal government's trying to do in terms of. So if we were to expand unemployment insurance or continue the emergency in the 6th year, might not we want to do something about the quality of the jobs programs that are available for the people that are on unemployment? Might we also want to give people back their dignity by having them do something in their community for the earning of that? There's been no tax dollars paid by any worker for this program. They didn't contribute anything to it through their past unemployment fees, FICA fees. Would we not do better what Norway has done and show that people will start hunting for a job earlier if you plus up the benefits early and taper the benefits later so that they start looking for a job long before they run out of benefits? And what the studies actually show, especially the 3 states that have now been disqualified from this, is that their employment numbers went up, their unemployment went down, and the number of people needing assistance actually went down as well. So it's one thing to say we want to help people. It's totally different when it's all in a political context about the next election. Which brings me to my final point. I believe children need to have a good start toward school. But as the senator from Delaware just mentioned, we're going to add $1 billion to Head Start, and that's going to give us 90,000 new kids in Head Start. If anybody does the math on that, $11,000 per year for a Head Start program? Think about that. Give the money to the states and let them run it themselves outside of the federal government. They'll do it for $4,000. or $5,000. But because it's a federal program, it costs twice what it should. Or if you did it to the state, you could do $180,000 versus what we're doing. So we're going to have a debate. Hopefully we'll get back to the unemployment insurance. But if we want to have that debate, it's got to be paid for. We owe that to the very people that we say we want to help. And number two is you got to have the input of everybody, not just one person in the Senate. I'll finish up by saying this. When you see this poll that 21% of the country thinks the biggest problem in the country is us, the government, the corruption, the abuse of power, the poor leadership, that's the specific things that were mentioned in this poll. What we ought to do is look inside. Say, why is that? And that is because we concentrate on the political and not on the people. We use them as pawns to advantage our own political careers, our own elections, and the good, long-term, best interest of the country gets sacrificed. And what this poll shows is the American people are pretty darn smart. They're pretty darn smart. Because they see the problem, they know what it is, and they know what's going to happen. And so we're going to pass a bill that's going to spend trillions of dollars, over $1 trillion, with all sorts of favors in there, not truly earmarks, but boy, as close to them as you can come, with new programs by the appropriators instead of the authorizing committee. That's the other thing that's in this bill. Programs written by the Appropriations Committee instead of the authorizing committee, that's in this bill. And we're going to pass this bill. And this number is going to jump from 21% to 25%. The jig's up. You can no longer come down here and say, with honesty, here's what we're doing. Because what we're doing is not honest. And what the American people say is, what they're saying with this is integrity matters. Straightforwardness matters. Truth in budgeting and spending matters. At least if we're going to do this, let's own up to what we're doing. Let's not be dishonest with the American public about the numbers. Mr. President, I yield the floor.